Welcome to a Tech Moment on Cannabis Tech. I'm your host, Christina Etter. In this podcast, we take just a few minutes to discuss the science and technology that's impacting the cannabis and hemp industries, as well as the business behind these two emerging powerhouses. So with hemp getting federal legalization in 2018 and cannabis getting deemed essential during a national health crisis, what once was a questionable movement is now starting to look more and more enticing for investment opportunities. And so as these rules start to change, making a wise investment into the cannabis industry is really starting to pay off well. And in today's show, we're going to talk more about investing in the cannabis industry with Matt Carr, who is the Chief Trends Strategist at the Oxford Club. And he's going to talk to us about what is really the important information in investing in cannabis, and what does the potential of investing in cannabis really kind of look like. So welcome to the show, Matt. I'm excited to have this conversation.
Hey, well, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Absolutely. So before we dive into all the fun stuff, though, let's talk a little bit about your history and what kind of brought you here to investing in the cannabis and hemp industries, and how did you get down this path?
It's actually kind of interesting. I actually started out on the investing side in oil and natural gas, uranium, some of those precious metals. So I do have that commodities background. I began just doing natural gas price reports, for all the different hubs throughout the United States. That was where I learned to do a lot of my data analysis, a lot of just getting comfortable with numbers and just staring at trades, scrolling across the screen all the time. But for cannabis, that actually goes back a little bit further. If I can just make a little bit of a segue. It was amazing to me. Most people probably come into contact with cannabis or become aware of it, high school, college.
Right.
That's where it starts being introduced like recreationally. Well, here I was living in Maryland, and at this time, cannabis was illegal in the United States, both medicinally and recreationally, at all state levels. And a family member came up to me and talked about if I could get them some cannabis because they had a friend that was going through chemo, and that chemo was very hard on them, and they were struggling. And this was something that was illegal in Maryland, and that stuck to me, that like, well, here's a medicine that we do know has these benefits, especially for people that are in very terminal kind of situations. And here, this family member who is, much older, is approaching me, this young kid working at Starbucks, about, trying to get them, some cannabis to help their friend. So that's kind of been with me, my entire life. So
that's fantastic.
Yeah. So when I went through commodities, and kind of went into credit and regular investing, that stuck with me. And in 2014, when we started seeing, Canopy became the first, or Tweed became the first publicly traded company, you start thinking that maybe there's an idea here, especially after Colorado and Washington, and then all these other states starts legalizing recreational use. So that was when I really became involved in the space. Was in those years, and we really began to pay attention and prepare investors in 2017, which I still felt was a little bit early because the markets have kind of like a short-term outlook. But we started preparing investors for that because of the upcoming nationwide legalization that would take place in Canada in October of 2018.
Right.
So that's how I got that was how I got into this space, and where my background is I began in commodities, ultimately ended up moving more into small caps and tech, but then also cannabis because of all those backgrounds kind of converging.
Right. And I'm going to tell you, one of the things that I find so refreshing about this industry is that when you have conversations like this with people like you, it's always so interesting to hear those stories and to really understand that there's more that compels us to become a part of this industry than just the sole purpose of making the money alone. There's always something there. There's that story in our background that has kind of opened up our eyes or opened up our minds really to the benefits that could be extrapolated from a plant. And I think that's one thing that really kind of encourages me about this industry, is hearing those stories.
Yeah, and it's been really kind of fascinating to me over the last several years. When I began talking about it, there was kind of like these jokes like, oh, Matt's 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 tasting his own stash, all this kind of stuff.
Oh,
But
right.
then, right, um, but then people would come up to me after I gave like a presentation or a talk, and especially older people. First, it was like they'd ask a question about CBD or some sort of medicinal, and then it became more, and it became more, and it became more, and then we would you'd be at these receptions or cocktail receptions at these conferences, and that's what all of these people were talking about. That you know there was no longer this shame or stigma that you could be like, yes, I have trouble sleeping, I use this CBD, or I take 2 puffs of this before I go to bed, I feel great, I've slept better now than ever. I have this much pain, phantom pain because of maybe some sort of serious or traumatic injury. So that to me has been very encouraging and very moving just over the past several years. That it's not just the younger generations, which really was kind of the thought in the beginning, but it is this older side, this medicinal side that really has a big staying power.
Right. Yeah, it's definitely, you can see the industry shifting, and it's really kind of fun to be a part of it and see how things are shifting in that direction. Personally, I mean, from my position and my role here with this publication, I really feel like it is the science and the technology and the regulation really that's kind of helping bring cannabis more into a legitimate industry and more respected, and some of the stigmas are starting to fall to the wayside now as these things are taking place and kind of shaping the industry. So it's really interesting for me to see that transformation, and it's happening so quickly to see things change. So it's such a fascinating time to be a part of the industry.
Yeah, like this is something like where we didn't think was going to be possible 10 years ago. we didn't
Right.
we didn't expect that there would be publicly traded cannabis companies, let alone publicly traded cannabis companies that are trading on major US exchanges, right? If we thought that they were going to trade there, it would be OTC or in the pink sheets, some of those more risky sort of pseudo exchanges. But now these are very legitimate businesses that have hundreds of millions of dollars and quarterly revenue, of growing footprints and expanding.
So now let's talk about investing in cannabis and hemp, because clearly this is something, like you said, just 10 years ago, we never would have thought possible. And now this is evolving into, something really interesting for a lot of people out there. Very, although there's still risk involved. It's not a federally legal substance yet, which we hope that's right around the corner. But let's talk a little bit about just what are some of the nuances that people need to take into consideration when they're thinking about investing in the cannabis and hemp industries?
Well, for cannabis, the biggest sort of takeaway that you're going to face is that separating the Canadian licensed producers from the U.S. multi-state operators, right? So your Canadian licensed producers, Canopy, Aurora, Afria, Kronos, Organogram, Hexo. These all trade on major U.S. exchanges, the NYSE and the NASDAQ. Those are really popular with younger investors because those are the ones that are available on Robinhood.
Oh,
And then those are also able to trade on the major exchanges here in the United States, because in Canada, it's legal at the federal level. So they're not violating any sort of law. Now, when you move into the United States, you have your U.S. multi-state operators: Green Thumb, Acreage, True Leaf, Planet 13, Cresco, Curaleaf, on and on and on and on. These all trade OTC, or on the over-the-counter exchange, which is not really an exchange. Those tend to be more for, I guess, kind of a little bit more savvy or retail investors, because again, you're not going to be trading on Robinhood. You're going to have to go through either some sort of classic or traditional brokerage account to access those. So that's the first part. Now, this is very, very interesting because to me, I believe the United States, we're talking about a $80 billion market by 2030. This is a big opportunity. I believe the global cannabis market is somewhere around $200 billion by then. When I first made that prediction, 2017, I was an outlier. I was on the upside, right? I think like the closest one was about $186 billion. Wow. Now, in the years that followed that, this is where I started having some concerns because I would talk to CEOs, interview CEOs, talk to industry experts, and all of a sudden the industry's size, the global size, was, it's not 200 billion. It's going to be 500 billion. It's going to be $1 trillion. It's going to be 1.5 trillion. Whatever the size of the beverage market is, it's going to be equal to that, on and on. And so I was like, do I need to change my projection? Because my projection was based, roughly 18.5% growth from 2016. And then the last few years of this decade, the growth would be around 21% per year, because you would start seeing more and more of the states, especially here in the US, legalize, and then a move take place at the federal level by that time. So the US multi-state operators have a much larger market to tap into, even though that they can't export, even though they can't cross state lines. You have to have this infrastructure duplicated over and over and over. But these are the companies that are actually having the biggest quarterly sales. Green Thumb recently became the first US multi-state operator to report more than $100 million in quarterly revenue. We'll probably see Curaleaf follow soon. And that's pretty big numbers, especially compared to their market caps, which aren't in the multi billions like Canopy, but they are producing more in revenue. Now, those Canadian companies, they have access to all of these international markets. This is where these guys not only have a footprint in Canada, but they've expanded into Germany, they've expanded into Latin America, into Australia, sometimes even into Africa. So those are right there. Those are you're starting out. Those are your two different flavors that you kind of have in the market, and that's what makes this really interesting, because then you can start breaking it down from there into who's got the biggest footprint, what are they focusing on. In Canada, if you're talking about Cannabis 2.0 products, those beverages or vape pens, things like that. So that's where I would begin, and then there's all kinds of interesting stuff that happens after that. Right.
Most definitely. Now, I'm assuming that most investors at this point are still kind of leaning towards ancillary investments, ancillary companies to get their feet wet. But are you seeing more people actually investing in the cannabis companies now?
Well, I think when you look at the most popular holdings on Robinhood, Aurora is one of the top ones recently because of its big jump. But it is ancillary companies I do think are a great way to kind of tiptoe in, because you get that exposure. You're talking about like Grow Generation, which the hydroponics organic gardening store, Scott's Miracle Grow. Those are kind of nice ancillary plays. You can get into a REIT, innovative industrial properties. That is like one of my favorite holdings, because here's a company that supplies all that sale leaseback space for the US operators, pays a dividend, and this dividend has increased 600% in just the 4 years that it has been a publicly traded company. So I do like those ancillary plays. I do think there's other ones that get overlooked, like maybe like an Akerna. Talking about ERP or ERM software, because that's what I thought was before the global pandemic took place. This is what I thought 2020 was going to be about. I thought it was going to be a year where you would see these cannabis companies essentially kind of grow up, right? Like over the last couple of years, cannabis launched into the mainstream as we start seeing things change in the United States. But you had these cannabis companies, especially here, kind of fall on their face. You had this growth at any cost strategy, especially here in the United States. You'd have record deal after record deal after record deal. This was just setting up a situation where you had this massive share dilution, which is negative to investors.
Mm-hmm.
You had unchecked spending by CEOs, which,
Right.
again, decimated everything.
Right.
So there had to be a change. And this is where I thought you would really see technology step in, because when we look at the just the broader markets itself, and we think about how much technology has changed there, that was going to have to take place in cannabis. If you think back to 1958, the average stay of an S&P 500 component, that was how long it had been a component of the index, was 61 years. By 1980, that was 25. And in 2015, that had shrunk to 17 years. We now believe that by 2027, 3/4 of that index will ultimately be replaced, because that's technology, that's that digital disruption. Since 2000, more than half of all these Fortune 500 companies have either gone bankrupt, were acquired, or just simply ceased to exist purely because of digital disruption. So that was what I saw was looming for cannabis. This is where I thought they would have to start looking at companies like Akerna. You'd have to start looking at some sort of way to improve efficiencies. And I do think you're starting to see that, especially when you look at like Akerna's financials, about 12.9 million in revenue this year is their projection, but then next year looking at 24.5 million, right? So
Wow.
there is that growth.
Mm-hmm.
And so I do like those technology plays, especially in this space, because I do think that has to happen. Like, look at what has happened during this global pandemic, that the companies that are surviving and thriving are those that were already embracing this digital side. We had recommended Shopify, the e-commerce site, in November 2018.
Mm-hmm.
And that was because you had the launching of the legalization up in Canada, but there's no physical stores. Everybody was shopping online. So this to us was this easy digital play and disruption in this industry. And you saw that those shares have gone from $150 to over 1,000. Wow. And you've seen the company's revenue more than double, right? We're talking about like $2.9 billion next year. So those are those opportunities in cannabis that I like, that are these ancillary plays, but are also these technology plays, because that is what I believe has to happen in the industry to continue to survive and to thrive going forward.
Most definitely. Yeah, I totally agree there. I think technology is a critical force right now in the industry. From whether you're talking about compliance or, obviously on our publication here, I get to see a lot of the new consumer tech devices and the different things that we're learning through science that then fuels the innovation for technology. It's just very interesting to me to see how all of this plays together and starts to create almost a whole new playground for technology companies, for investors, for anybody really that's looking for a new segment, an exciting segment, I think, to kind of spread their wings a little.
Yeah, I think the next couple of years, I think you would definitely see like this big push into tech on, again, not just ERP, not just like e-com. We've been having this move into vertical cultivation over the last several years.
Mm-hmm.
Just normal food producers, Plenty, AeroFarm, Gotham Greens, these all kind of led that way. And you've seen all these companies that have to do it. Now, it's not easy. I mean, it would be great to be like, everybody switch to vertical cultivation. But, it is expensive. but that is taking place because those high pressure sodium lights, which were in use for so long and ran so hot, are being replaced by, much more efficient LEDs, and so that's providing that bridge to this move. It's been fascinating to me over the last couple of years too, is that some of the growers that I know and large scale operators, there was a time where you kind of had this thought like, well, if I know how to grow an acre, I can grow 1,000,000 acres.
Right.
And we know that that's not true, that leads to crop collapse, that leads to these failures because there's all these variabilities, these microclimates that are being caused by the plants themselves, that if you have a 500,000 square foot space, well, you're going to need all of these sensors for watching temperature and moisture to completely improve and make your product grow. Because we also talked that you can give the same seeds to 10 different growers and they'll come back with 10 different strains. Right? And for dispensary operators and stuff, that's a big challenge, because they're like, this guy had great stuff last month. Now that same strand this month is harsh and makes me cough. I can't sell this to patients or anybody. So
it is very, very interesting to see how the industry is learning. And you're right, there's so many of those people that were great at their small grows and maintaining 24 or 100 plants or whatever it is. But when you start to scale up, it becomes a completely different operation. And I think there's a disconnect there in just how much it takes to run a commercial operation like that. But you spoke of something that definitely, I think, plays into our industry a lot, and that's the agriculture side. It's obviously there's agricultural companies now that had been working on food production and helping in cornfields and soybean fields and things like that are now starting to look at the cannabis and hemp industries as well. So it's going to be very interesting, I think, to see how some of these other industries play into the cannabis and hemp success as legalization continues to spread.
Yeah, that's, kind of goes back to that old kind of Mark Twain saying that was like, during the gold rush, you want to be own the pick and shovel,
Right.
Self pick and shovel. And that's kind of what you're seeing again, that agriculture in and of itself has been revolutionized just over the last decade because of drones, because of all the smart technology that has been brought in. And I do think that does make its way into cannabis, especially as you start seeing larger and larger grow operations. I don't know if we'll see as big of outside operators as maybe like in Oregon or Washington, but you would hope, I mean, the industry itself would be, kind of changed overnight if there was something changed at the federal level that, let's say US operators could maximize the supply chain, that you could grow in a low cost environment outside, Oregon or Washington, have your product be manufactured and put together in Texas or Georgia and then sold to those high value markets, New York, Chicago, California. That'd be great. I mean, you don't have that at the moment, but you hope that that's on the horizon. I think that's where you'll also see more of that agricultural tech and a lot of that supply chain tech really start to come into play.
Right. And then you mentioned earlier too, the multi-state operators. How prime are they right now for when federal legalization actually does happen? They're already set up in multiple states. Setting up a distribution channel then is going to be easier, I would think.
Yeah, you would think. I would imagine as well. I mean, your biggest problems are going to be, I mean, you just have to dismantle all that duplicative infrastructure.
Oh, right.
And that would be fine. You could sell it off to, maybe a smaller player or whatever. But right now, one of those things that I've heard mentioned in the industry, that they've been, because of this illegal statute, that it's still legal at the federal level here in the United States, that has protected the U.S. multi-state operators from the well-funded Canadian licensed
Mm,
producers to come down and just gobble up all of the play.
right.
That that they still have to stay away, in part because of some TSX regulations where you can't own a business that's in violation of a federal law,
Right.
or you can be delisted.
Right. Well, actually that brings up a good point. And I would love to hear your thoughts on this. So I know that there's a lot of people out there that are really kind of fearful of this idea of big marijuana swooping in and taking over everything. But you made a comparison earlier to the beverage industry. And for me, at least from my personal perspective, I feel like that's more the direction that we're heading. That yes, there's going to be some of those bigger corporations out there. You have your Coors and your Anheuser-Busch's, and you have these big companies that are producing, but then we still have microbrews, and we still have all of these little breweries everywhere that we can go to if we prefer something different. And for me, that's really kind of the sensible way to view the future of the cannabis industry once legalization starts. I don't feel like these companies are going to absolutely strip away that ma and pa atmosphere that we have in many of these places right now. Do you?
No, I don't think so. I think there was what was it, Bruce Linton a couple years ago said that there's only going to be 5 or 6 cannabis companies when all is said and done. I and I think there could be 5 or 6 large ones, but I do believe that you are going to see all of these smaller operators. So I think the biggest thing right now for the industry, the biggest push maybe going forward, is going to be those discount brands, especially up in Canada. You've seen those be really attractive to the consumer because that makes it more sort of like comparable to the illicit market. We
uh,
have a lot of premium brands, and the hope was initially that the consumer would pay a higher dollar price to access this product because it's now legal, that you could just
mhm.
go to any place and you have this ease. It hasn't happened as quickly as we had hoped, but you are seeing that those discount brands are making inroads. So part of me, as you were kind of talking, I was thinking like, well, maybe it's more Walmart, Target first, right? Like these
Mm,
discount operators that really gobble up, and then it breaks back down into more of the craft. Because I don't believe that the industry is going to be destroyed by big marijuana or big cannabis or that fear. I think the industry itself is very unique. Even when you look at the CEOs of these companies, I've always found it so fascinating that there's like kind of these 2 different brands. On one side, you have the cowboy CEO, the Silicon Valley CEO, the guys that wear sports coats and graphic tees, and they've just been in the business for a very long time. They're just entrepreneurial. And then the other CEOs they've got doctorates in pharmaceuticals, biotech, right? That's
mhm.
their background. So you have this very interesting culture right now in the space that I think that's going to help drive it forward.
Definitely. Yeah, I absolutely agree with that as well. Now, if someone is listening to this podcast and they are interested in like what's the first step that they need to take to start to maybe research their options in investing in cannabis?
What are their first steps?
Hmm.
Um, one, you want to definitely understand your risk tolerance. It's still a nascent industry, so it is very, very volatile. I would not go uh, full hog, right? Like you're just going to just go plow into the industry with everything. Start nibbling, start researching.
Hmm.
You want to look at companies if you're going to go straight after like a multi-state operator, kind of
Okay.
what their footprint is, who's got the largest footprint, who's actually turning profits, because that'll be a big driver going forward. Because like I was mentioning earlier, that growth of any cost, that is still an overhang for a lot of companies right now. Um, and then if you're looking at Canadian, you want some international exposure. Look at those big plays. I always talk about the 3 companies that I always suggest people start with Canopy because it's just a nice blue chip in the industry. It's got the most celebrity endorsements. You got Snoop, you got Seth Rogen, you've got Martha Stewart. Right?
Right.
You can't go wrong there. It's got like a great international footprint, and its new CEO is all about reducing those costs. Besides the fact that it's also got this huge backing from Constellation Brands to produce these Cannabis 2.0 beverages.
Right. Right.
So that's one, and then innovative industrial properties, the cannabis REIT, because that pays you a little bit more than a 4% dividend yield. A little bit, it's going to be higher priced, but it tends to move. When things are great for cannabis, it does well, and when things are bad for cannabis, it doesn't do as poorly. Right? So I mean, shares will drop, but it's not good because it has that yield. It is doing that. Like people aren't just like selling it off. So that's what I like. And like I said, again, that 600% increase in the dividend over the last several years is excellent. And then a little small play like Grow Generation, which gives you all of this exposure to all of these different markets, but through this ancillary route, through hydroponics, through organic soil, and then Akerna, which I believe everybody's going to have to start looking at ERP and ERMs, and they're kind of that first mover. So those would be the kind of places that I would start looking at and starting with, and then going from there. Whether you want to start focusing on vaporizer producers, packaging producers, all that kind of stuff, because that's the most exciting thing about this industry, because this is an industry being born, and there's still all of these companies that supply all of these different things. Mm-hmm. And you have this tremendous upside. The other comparison I use is, there's roughly 200 publicly traded cannabis companies, 1,200 cryptocurrencies. Mm-hmm. So you have 6 times as many cryptocurrencies as you do cannabis companies.
Wow.
That shows like how small that this industry still is, but you have this massive, massive, massive upside.
Right. So now let's talk a little bit about the Oxford Club. What is it that the Oxford Club does? I mean, what is your ultimate mission? And tell me a little bit about what the Oxford Club is.
Okay, the Oxford Club is a financial publishing group. We have hundreds of thousands of members, and our goal really is to promote people's financial independence. We believe that you don't need a broker, you don't need to be going through, sort of like mainstream financial media, that we can provide research, which is what we do, to help investors meet those goals, especially retirement goals. And so that's what we've been doing for a little over 30 years at this point, based out of Baltimore. We've grown from, a very small company into having, like I said, hundreds of thousands of members that subscribe to our stuff and that rely on our recommendations that we put out each and every week. So that is our ultimate goal. Like I said, is this whole path of financial independence for the average investor.
Gotcha. So talk to me a little bit about your memberships. What are the benefits of being a member at the Oxford Club?
Oh, we have different levels. So if you wanted to, let's say, for example, you wanted to try out some of my sort of research, you could sign up for a free e-letter, which is profittrends.com. That's just a base entry. Mm-hmm. Then I have a monthly newsletter that goes out called Strategic Trends Investor. And then I also operate 3 VIP research services, the Dynamic Fortunes, the Viper Alert, and Trailblazer Pro. And those send out recommendations about every other week. Though I'll send out emails every week talking about the portfolio. We'll be closing out positions, taking gains. Those VIP research services, they're a little bit higher cost, but we're doing options and stocks. So the monthly newsletter would be longer term holds, but the VIP research services are more quick paced sort of trading.
Fantastic. So the last thing I'm going to ask you, Matt, is if someone needs to get a hold of you or wants to get a hold of you and talk more about some investments, how would they go about doing that?
Well, my first thing I would suggest is go to our website, profittrends.com, sign up for that. That's our free e-letter. We also have a YouTube channel that I put out every Friday. You can see me do my little videos where I talk about a bunch of different things. We talk about cannabis, we talk about tech, we talk about 5G, anything that's on that cutting edge that investors like. That's what we really focus on. So that's where I would start. And you can always go to oxfordclub.com and check that out as well.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Matt. It's always fascinating to listen to everybody's perspective on this industry, and investing in this industry just seems like now's the right time. I just can't see anything but good things in the future for the cannabis industry. So I really hope that some of our listeners take your advice and start to do their research.
Oh, well, thank you for having me. It was a lot of fun.
All right. Thanks, Matt.
Bye.